Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Kaustubh Grog. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all to this event. I'm happy to share that Principal Chief Commissioner, sir, of Central Tax, Bengaluru Zone, DP Nagendra Kumar, sir, and Chief Commissioner of Customs, Bengaluru Zone, Mandalika Srinivas, sir, have kindly graced this occasion. I also extend my greetings to other senior members and colleagues of the CBIC family, friends, and viewers who have logged in for this event. This is a third in part of our series called Exchange, in which the Karnataka chapter of the IRS Association has sought to engage with accomplished individuals outside our stream so as to deepen the conversations and sort of broaden the horizon. First program was done with Professor S. Ranganathan from ISB, and the next one was with Lucky Ali, the famous singer. It's my honor now to introduce our today's speaker, Manu S. Pillai. Manu has basically been a Pune boy. He has done his graduation from the prestigious Ferguson College there. Okay. He has worked with Dr. Shashi Tharoor and Lord Karnat Willimoria in the House of Lords in various capacities. Manu has published widely in the Mint, the Hindu, the Times of India, Open Magazine, amongst other publications. Manu's first book, Ivory Throne, Chronicles of the House of Travancore, came out in 2015. He followed this up with the hugely popular Rebel Sultans, the Deccan from Khilji to Shivaji, in the year 2018. And his most recent book, The Courtesan, the Mahatma and the Italian Brahmin, Tales from Indian History, has come out in 2019. I must mention here, ladies and gentlemen, Manu's first book, Ivory Throne, was given the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar in 2017, which is a special honor indeed. I might also add, Manu has achieved all of this while he just about completed 30 years of age. I know age is a relative thing, but I'm suddenly feeling old and under-accomplished after having gone through this little introduction of ours. Might I also add, Manu is a doctoral student at King's College London. In fact, he's rushing through his deadlines to complete his PhD thesis. We wish him the very best. The scheme of today's program is Manu will introduce, talk to us for maybe 10 minutes. Then we'll move into a conversation with Amitesh Bharat Singh, sir, ADGDRI, Bengaluru Zone. After that, I think everybody can come in and we can have a interaction. Over to you, Manu.
Thank you very much, Kaustubh, and thank you everybody in the audience for your patience as well, and thank you to the senior dignitaries who are present here. I'm very glad that you've made the time to join us for this discussion. It adds a little pressure on me, but hopefully we'll leave the program, and nobody will regret having attended it. Yeah. Now, Kaustubh mentioned the three books that I've produced, so I'll work backwards with them. The latest is called The Courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin. And it's a rather serpentine name for a book. Usually when we pick book titles, we choose, catchy titles. We choose titles that people can immediately recall. But I decided that, I needed a title that reflected the three broad research concerns that in any case, sort of animate my work. For instance, the courtesan, that represents gender. Because often when we talk about Indian history, often when we talk about history in general, we talk about kings, we talk about empires, we talk about battles and dates. And we forget that history wasn't merely created by men, history was also created by women. It's just that we haven't been taught to look at the contributions of the women in history. Now, the reason I use the word courtesan is because courtesans were in a country where women were by and large illiterate. They were as a class, they were illiterate women. They were economically independent women. They were capable of not only producing lots of art and create a lot of creative output, but also in terms of patronizing temples, construction projects. One of the earliest drama companies in India, a modern drama company in the 19th century, was set up by a woman, a Devdasi called Balamani. They were entrepreneurs, they were playwrights, they were people who accomplished a great deal. And through them, we can trace a lot of Indian history itself. The second is the idea of the Mahatma. Now, from the title, most people may imagine that it is about Mahatma Gandhi, but it's actually about Mahatma Phule, because, before Gandhi got the tag of Mahatma, it was Jyotiba Phule who got that particular title from the people. And what is interesting is that, he, to me, represents that Indian tradition of always asking inconvenient questions. Sometimes when we think of tradition, when we think of the past, we think, oh, everybody was very pious back in the day, everything functioned perfectly back in the day, everybody followed rules, everybody was very orthodox. We forget that no, there is an argumentative tradition in India as well. Our intellectual history is deeply influenced by people who were capable of asking a very tough question sometimes, and Phule was one of those people. In the 19th century, when it's a story that may perhaps get some people, if they tried it today, into trouble. But when people would claim that the Brahmins were superior in caste because they were created from the head of the cosmic creator, whereas the Shudras, for example, came from the feet. Phule was the one who, for example, asked that if the Brahmins came from the cosmic creator's head, does that mean the cosmic creator menstruates through the mouth? Now, you can't really imagine a 19th century man actually saying something like this, but it's a symbol of the kind of sharp-pointed questions. We had internal critics within India. We had people who were capable of reflecting on our old traditions and cultures and asking the tough questions that mattered. And finally, the idea of the Italian Brahmin. This, in many ways, represents human quirk. Because again, as I said, history is not merely about dates and battles and very serious things. History is also made by human beings. It is made by individuals. And individuals always have human quirks. Individuals can also be very comical. They can always be also be very entertaining. They can also be full of contradictions. They have no consistency. Whether it is 1,000 years ago or whether it is now, while contexts change, human behavior doesn't change. So there's enough to amuse yourself in history with human beings. And the Italian Brahmin actually represents or refers to a 17th century Italian called Roberto de Nobili, who came down to Madurai, became a Christian missionary there. And he discovered that in this big temple town with these big Hindu rulers who were in power, he wasn't getting the kind of converts he wanted. He was getting converts from marginalized castes, but he was not getting the Brahmins to convert. So he decided, look, to get the Brahmins, I'm going to become a Brahmin. So suddenly this Italian man starts wearing a punul, or a sacred thread. Suddenly he starts wearing saffron robes like a sannyasi. Suddenly his meals are cooked only by Brahmins, and he eats the local Tamil fare that all the local people there eat. He creates a caste system in his church where he says only the higher caste people can sit and the lower caste people must stand at the back. He in many ways Hinduizes himself. He in many ways Brahminizes himself, and is actually treated that way. There is an account of him visiting a local Nayaka ruler, and the ruler actually welcomes him by pouring water on his feet and laying out a leopard skin or a tiger skin for this gentleman to sit on, and he's treated very much like any other Hindu guru from that time. And so the third book essentially brings these three elements together in short, snippety sort of essays. Then you go back to the second book that I did, which is Rebel Sultans. And that is a history of the Deccan, which from Khilji to Shivaji, that's the subtitle of the book. And I grew up in Pune, as Kaustubh said. And I always thought that in our textbooks, we spoke a lot, or we read a lot about the Mughals. We learned a lot about the Marathas. But I always kept wondering what was here before that sensational clash between the Mughals and the Marathas. Who were the people who created the foundation for this to emerge? And seeking that answer sort of, threw up the most fascinating world. A lot of people today living in Maharashtra may not be aware that there were black begums, there were African queens ruling in Ahmednagar. A lot of people may not. It was actually a general called Malik Ambar who kept the Mughals at bay for 25 years, along with Shivaji's grandfather. And Shivaji emerged later, very much respecting Malik Ambar's legacy, and Shivaji paid tribute to Malik Ambar. We don't know that the Adil Shahs of Bijapur, we know the name, but when we think of them as a Muslim sultanate, we forget that they were created by a Persian man and a Maratha lady. It was their marriage that created this particular dynasty, and that one of the most prominent Adil Shahs, Ibrahim Adil Shah II, was a Sunni Muslim, but he also called himself son of Saraswati and Ganapati. And in one of his literary works, before he pays homage to the Prophet Muhammad, he actually begins with an invocation to Saraswati. And to me, it was always fascinating to think that, wow, we have these notions of identity, and here are some examples from the past where those notions are challenged very much by real historical people. You have Orthodox Shia Muslims like the Nizam Shahs in Ahmednagar, who ironically were converted. They were descendants of a converted Brahmin, and they stayed in touch with their Brahmin relatives and, sort of took care of their Brahmin relatives, even as they became Shia Muslims, and they would send off their own bodies to be buried in Karbala in Iraq. Then you have the Qutub Shahs of Golconda. They originally came from Persia, but ended up becoming one of the greatest royal dynasties to patronize the Telugu language. And this includes patronage of poets like Kshetraya, who compose padams for them on Hindu divinities and so on. And these sultanates, whether it's the architecture, whether it's the culture, whether it is the literary patronage, the cultural patronage, all of that spoke to me. And I thought, we need to bring this history of the Deccan back into the limelight, back into the mainstream. And of course, the first book. Now, my third book is a collection of very short essays. Each of them is about 4 or 5 pages at most. The second book is only about 300 pages. It's a very sort of pacey read. It moves very briskly. But the first book is, the heaviest of the three. It's 700 pages. It takes its own time to sort of, you'll take your time to absorb its contents. And although it's 700 pages, it actually covers a fairly narrow period. And it's set, the Ivory Throne refers to the throne of the Travancore Maharajas, who are very famous now for their association with the Padmanabha Swami temple in Trivandrum. But the book really is about the 2 last Maharanis of Travancore. And what really interested me about their story was the matrilineal tradition in Travancore. I have a habit of going and searching for slightly unknown elements in history, or little known or little studied elements in history, or little studied characters in history even. And the matrilineal system to me was a great eye-opener, because in my own family, we would go to Kerala in the summer vacations from Pune, and I would discover that, instead of a woman getting married and going to live with her husband, in our families, the husband came and lived with the woman. It was perfectly normal for orthodox upper caste Hindu women to divorce if they did not get along with their husband. And there was no stigma attached to it. Widowhood was not a concept at all. And in fact, in the royal family, it led to all kinds of comical situations, comical from our perspective now. Because, for example, the Maharani's husband was not the Maharaja. He was just called the consort. And he did not even have permission to sit in the presence of his wife. He was not permitted to call his wife by name. He had to call his wife Your Highness. His own children and wife outranked him. They had precedence over him, and he was considered a subject, not a member of the family. At feasts in the palace, the Maharani's husband would get 2 desserts served in his plantain leaf. The Maharani would eat 4 desserts because she was 1 rank higher than him. One of the great scandals in the 1910s in the Travancore Darbar was when the Maharaja found out that his niece, who was the then Rani of the state, was seen driving in the same car with her husband. And he said, no, your husband cannot sit in the same car with you. Especially, he can't sit next to you, because if your husband sits next to you, it signifies equality, and he is not your equal. He has to follow in a smaller car behind you. He can't even sit in the same car as you. So much so that when these husbands of these princesses died, they were not even, their cremations were not even attended by their wife and children, because the wife and children were royalty, and royalty do not attend the cremations of private subjects of the state. So it may have been a father, it may have been husband to the queen, but he was still a private citizen of the state. And to me, this entire universe was so completely bewildering at first, to think that when we think of Indian history, there are certain stereotypes we get. Whereas in reality, if you look at different corners of India, you'll find all kinds of vivid stories, all kinds of cultural practices that may surprise us today, because they are not what we think they might be. They're not the orthodox or the stereotypical idea of what orthodoxy means. For the Malayalis, this was pretty orthodox. In fact, to suggest that a man and a woman formed a nuclear family was the innovation. Otherwise, it was the man coming to the woman's house and staying there very much on her terms, and the children inheriting the mother's property, not the father's property. And all this mattered a great deal in making Kerala culture what it was. So much so that these men used to even get salaries. So in the Cochin royal family, the princesses used to take Brahmin husbands. And if they were from exalted families, the husbands used to get 8 rupees a month in the Raj era. And if they were from ordinary Brahmin families, the husbands used to get 6 rupees a month. And there's a story that one of these husbands finally went to the Maharaja of Cochin and complained that you can't have 2 rates of pay for men performing the same job. So then everybody was upgraded to 8 rupees a month. Even the term used for them, they were called irippugar, which in Malayalam simply means people who sit in the house of their women. And they're not called husband, or those terms did not exist. The women would say, where is your irippugar? Which is, where is the man who sits, well, I suppose outside your door. And these husbands are only allowed to visit their wives when they are invited by the wives. So everything is policed and organized in a completely different manner. Although now it's no longer legally recognized, often in ritual terms, this still matters. So when my own father passed away, for example, although I did the kriyas or the funeral rituals, technically, in the old-fashioned way, I had no right to do it. His sister's children have the right to do the funeral ritual. I have no command, or I have no ritual permission to perform my own father's funeral rites, because he's considered a member of a different family. I'm considered a member of my mother's family. So each of these books was in a quest that I had to try and uncover some of these untold stories. The first book had a lot of political drama and tension, where the so-called protagonist and the so-called villain were both very powerful Maharanis. They were sisters who were queens and did not get along, and this power play between them, in many ways, it reminds you of today's politics as well. Everything we complain about in contemporary politics existed even then. It's not like our ancestors lived in a different planet where everything functioned differently. So too with the second book. It was about resurrecting these lost sultans who were so interesting and colorful and vivid, and yet we had somehow forgotten them. And the third book, again, with the themes of gender, bringing out women, bringing out quirky characters, it was again about resurrecting some of these lost stories of Indian history. I'll end there, by the way. I don't want to talk more in a monologue.
Thank you, Manu, for that wonderful introduction. In fact, the books that you have written, all three of them, I've read through two of them, as I told you. The first one which you have written is still lying with me. It's nearly been a year, and I will get around to reading it sometime. But the times that you talk about seem like wonderful times, which are past. The man used to be get a salary just for being a husband. I wish some of that will come back now. But on a more serious note, your books definitely, and let me start by paying off a compliment to you. Your books are most wonderfully layered with rich anecdotal narrative built into them. You have already been honored with the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar in 2017. And as they say, that history is a story which is told well. Now, I do remember my own childhood, where some of the stories that we have grown up with, especially the stories which are there in the northern part of our country, the great Mughals, how the British came in, even the Mahabharata, they were often relayed to me through storytelling by different people, some of them who used to work in our household, some through my mother, some through my father. And I've always kind of, looked forward to, inculcating in myself, and I'm sure when I say this, there are others like me, an art of storytelling. But I was never going to be a very good storyteller. My stories would finish in about 2 or 3 or 4 minutes. And that way, I envy you. You are such a wonderful storyteller. And history, as I said, is about telling the story well. And like any good narrative, when you write history, it's about recounting the tales of our forebearers, and the aim is not only to create an image of the past, but to kind of create an understanding of what we see, right? And most of the history, I have read your books, at least a couple of them, and then my mind goes back to the books that we have read as a part of our academic study in colleges and schools, and they're very different. Those used to be about times and dates and places, and there was not really much of a character in them. Like you said, when you speak about Shivaji, there would invariably be an Adil Shah or some other person who would be peeking into that story, but we really wouldn't get to know much about who this character was, how he got into the story, and so forth. But reading through your books, now we see those wonderful creatures come alive in their full glory in the short 3 to 4 pages that you have devoted to most of them. Now, let me kind of come first to the last book that you have written. The Italian Brahmin is easy enough to identify, and you've done it. Roberto Di Nobili. There were 2 contenders for the for the Mahatma's title. One was Jyotirao Phule, and the other was Mahatma Gandhi. You laid it out clearly that what you had in mind was Jyotirao Phule. And therefore, the Courtesan, there appear to be multiple contenders. Now, there is Bhagmati, Khunja Humayun, Begum Samru, one Balmani, one Mudu Pillai, Gohar Jan, Savitri of Thrissur, and I'm sure I may have missed out a few. Why don't you tell us a little about them?
Begum Samru in many ways is my favorite in the book, because the career arc is so fascinating. She begins life pretty much as an orphan. Her father dies when she is an infant, and her mother's thrown out, and she is raised practically in one of these brothels in Chandni Chowk, which was in the then imperial capital of Delhi. And Mughal Delhi is going through its own decline at the time. A lot of North Indian politics is up in the air. New successor states are emerging in different areas, Awadh, etc., the Nizams in the south. And there are these mercenary armies that are going around. And this girl from this brothel in Chandni Chowk, at some point, in the 1760s, as a young woman, she meets a mercenary. And the mercenary, interestingly, is from, well, the borders of Germany and France, around that place. He's generally described as a German. And she becomes his companion. I can't call her his wife, because he already had a wife and a son. She essentially becomes his lover and joins his mercenary army. She stays with him for a few years. And this man is called the Butcher of Patna, because many years before this, he had captured for one of the Nawabs of Bengal. He defeated a bunch of Englishmen and then invited them all for dinner as his prisoners of war, saying, "You're prisoners of war, I'll treat you well." And then at the dinner, he cut all their throats and killed them. So he was called the Butcher of Patna, a very ferocious sort of character. She joins him and his troop of, say, 3,000 odd mercenary soldiers. And when he dies about 8-9 years later, she successfully not only edges out the son he has from his legal wife, she very successfully takes over the army. She becomes the head of the army, and after that, she becomes the Begum Samru that the world will know. Samru is actually just an Indianization of Somra, which was her husband's. He was called, that was one of the names given to him by various people, and she was called Samru for that reason. And suddenly you have this ex-dancing girl becoming the leader of an army. In that capacity, on multiple occasions, when the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam is besieged by enemies in Delhi, it is this ex-courtesan who rides to his rescue and relieves the Mughal capital of the invading armies. He becomes so fond of her and so grateful to her that he gives her titles such as Pillar of the Empire, Daughter of the Emperor, things like that. And it's, again, remember always that this girl came from a brothel. To be styled Daughter of the Emperor was a very senior sort of title to get. To command the loyalties of 3,000, 4,000 men, and the army kept growing, was an extremely unusual thing for a woman to do at that time. And other than that, there were also, of course, personal challenges she had in the process. She fell in love with another European. Her army troops didn't like him, so they actually, tried to kill him, tied her up to a gun carriage, and left her out for a week in the sun, hoping that she would die. She did not die. She bounced back, reclaimed the loyalties of her army, continued on as Begum Samru. In the process, also decided to convert to Christianity for some reason. Built one of the greatest churches that exist in North India, in Sardana. Had a huge mansion in Delhi, and died in the 1830s as one of the richest women in northern India. She didn't have children. But if you look at that career trajectory, from brothel to palace, from a girl without among many in a dancing house, to daughter of the emperor and pillar of the Mughal of the state, to becoming an ally of the East India Company, to having such wealth. And because she didn't have children, even now it is said that that fortune is unclaimed. There's actually a website where you can go and register your claim for that money. Because her Begum Samru's fortune is still unclaimed by anybody, and the British state sort of kept it aside. And it's just such a remarkable story. So too with some of these other Devdasis, etc. Muddupalni was in Tanjavur under the Maratha kings of Tanjavur, who were great patrons of Telugu poetry, etc. And she's somebody who wrote a remarkable piece of erotica. Really, it's called the Radhika Santwanamu, in which it's a very sensuous piece of poetry, in which it's basically about Radha and Krishna, and Radha getting very jealous about Krishna having just got married to somebody. And first she takes the girl. Radha is much older, of course, so Radha prepares the girl, takes her to Krishna's bedchamber. But once she's left the girl there, Radha becomes full of rage and envy. And the poem is about how Krishna has to then soothe her, conciliate her, and sort of win her affection back. And it is a highly erotic work of literature. What is more interesting is not the sensual nature of the literature itself, but how that one text can tell us about ourselves and our changing morality. For instance, in her day, Muddupalni in the late 18th century was celebrated as a great poet. In her own introduction, she talks about how her ancestors, her mother, her grandmother were all famed and talented women. But the funny thing is, by the late 19th century, when this Victorian sort of morality came into India, where our notion of tradition became highly Christianized in some ways. Missionary criticism was imbibed. We became highly touchy about a lot of our social practices. men became extremely uncomfortable about Muddu Palani and her poetry. So when her poetry was once published, it was published under the name Muddu Pillai, because they actually wanted to pretend a man wrote it and not a woman, because they didn't want anybody knowing that Indian women were capable of writing sensuous poetry. When it was again published more properly without the censorship of the name or the content, the British authorities got it banned because of a furor among certain orthodox men. And it took till after independence for the book to be finally released after that. Even so, in the 1980s, when there were scholars looking for the original text and trying to translate it into English, somebody they met, he said, "Why are you going after this kind of poetry? This is not the kind of poetry you should be resurrecting and republishing." So really, Muddu Palani's story is not merely about what she wrote or what she created or about that romance between Radha and Krishna. It's also about the same text and how it can achieve and have mutating meanings in different generations. At the time of creation, seen as a great literary work. 50 years later, under Victorian influence, seen as something to be forgotten, then brought back by somebody, seen as contraband, banned. Even after independence, when it was no longer banned, people were still embarrassed about it. So it tells a lot about our evolution as a society than anything else. And other courtesans also, like the Balamani, as I said, she was the one who set up that drama company in Kumbakonam. Trains, it is said, used to stop in Kumbakonam for specific durations, and they used to be called Balamani Express. So people could get off, go catch one of her drama shows, and then get back on the train and continue the journey. When kings build temples and renovate temples, they inscribe their donations, and we learn about it, we talk about it. But Balamani also helped restore and renovate the great temple in Kumbakonam. But we don't talk about it because she was not a married woman, because she was a Devdasi. And today there is stigma attached to that particular identity. So with these courtesans, that's what I was trying to do, trying to sort of point out when the stigma came in, and the fact that perhaps we shouldn't stigmatize them simply because they were unmarried women with a certain amount of sexual autonomy and had their own independent resources and did not fit into Victorian patterns of what womanhood or womanly identity should be.
So, throughout your stories, I mean, women have come across as strong characters with distinct individualities. The heroine in the popular Indian imagination is, as you put it, one of pious domesticity, or she is a warrior queen. But the way even you have portrayed Mirabai is quite different from the stories that we have learned of growing. Let me ask you, you've also mentioned about the Victorian prudishness, which came as an overlay on the way we thought and dealt with our women in India. So, how is the position? What is your take on it? I mean, how about the position that women have occupied in the society in India? How much of it is due to the Victorian notions of morality has made a very thick and a rich overlay? And is it really attributable to our inherited sense of correctness, or is it simply that one more layer has kind of skewed things very differently? I remember you mentioned a story about Kama Sutra in a very different perspective. So perhaps you'd like to kind of tell us about it?
Yeah, you see, women have always, in that sense, around the world received secondary treatment. Even in Kerala, which is matrilineal, it is not completely equal between men and women. It is just less unequal. It is a little less unfair. It doesn't mean that it's completely paradisical and everything is wonderful. Now, with Mira, a lot of it is also about perspective, right? The same topic can be approached from two perspectives. When we think about Mirabai, what is the standard image we get? If you look at even these graphics that people create for newspaper publications and magazines when writing about her, will show her with a veena or something. The idea is we have put her as a bhajan singer, as somebody who wrote, authored, and sang these wonderful bhajans of Krishna, a great devotee of Krishna, and somebody who wandered about singing Krishna's praises. And that is the aspect of Mirabai that we have elevated. But Mirabai's story is actually slightly more human, in the sense that she was married to a Rajput prince. She was from a royal family, the wife of a Rajput prince. When he died, and this is in her own poetry, when he died, she was asked to become a sati. She said, "I will not become a sati." Then they said, "You must live like a widow, a life of self-denial." And she said, "No, I will not live a life like that. I will go out, I will meet sages, I will meet intellectuals, I will meet other Krishna bhaktas. I will have my freedom." She talks about how attempts were made to kill her, which is again essentially what you're talking about is the same kind of cases we read of today, where in-laws attempt to sort of get rid of their daughters-in-law, etc. So she talks about that. And finally, she walks out of the palace and says, I completely give this up. I'm going to become a wandering saint. In doing that, it's not a minor thing because she's essentially walking out of a Rajput royal setting and choosing her own way. She's essentially ostracizing herself from Rajput society. For a woman to do that, that is, in those days, it was the height of defiance. So when we remember Mirabai purely as a Krishna Bhakta, we forget that she was also a woman who was highly defiant of social norms at the time, of what it expected of women. It wanted her to commit sati. She said, no, I will not. And so at every level, she was defying what a sort of patriarchally designed world expected of her. And she said, no, I will define my own terms. I will define my own existence. And I will not be led by the pressure of society on me. And that's, Mirabai. So too, in the epics, it's not even like the women of the epics have escaped. Because if you look at the story of Shakuntala, for example, the story that we all generally hear is the Kalidas version of the story, which was written about 1,500 odd years ago. And the Kalidas's Abhijnana Shakuntalam is where you have the story where King Dushyanta is hunting. He comes to the ashram. He meets Shakuntala. She's very shy, so she never talks to him directly. It's her maids, etc. And he says he falls in love with her, and they have this Gandharva Vivaha. And he basically gives her a ring, saying, keep this ring with you, and then come to me later. And of course, another sage comes, a man with a great temper. And when he comes there, Shakuntala's head is in the clouds. He curses her, saying, whoever you're thinking about is going to forget about you. And then all her maids say, oh no, poor lady, she didn't mean it that way. So the man says, acha, fine. If the king sees the ring, he will remember her again, and all will be well. Now, of course, on the way to the king, the ring gets lost. She goes to the king's court. The king doesn't recognize her because of the curse. She starts crying. Her mother, the Apsara, comes and takes her away. La la la. And then the king eventually comes around. Now, this is Kalidas's Shakuntala. In the original Shakuntala, which appears in the Mahabharata, there is no ring. There is no curse. There are no maid servants. And Shakuntala is not shy, nor does she cry as such. In the original Mahabharata story of Shakuntala, when Dushyanta comes there is nobody there. He directly tells her that, look, I would like to have a relationship with you. First, she says no. Then finally, when she agrees, she extracts a promise from him. She says, the son born to me must be the king. So before she gives herself to the king, she actually makes sure that she has a certain security, or her son is guaranteed a certain security. There is no ring, there is no curse. Dushyanta simply goes back. She has a slightly strange 36-month pregnancy, at the end of which she gives birth to the child. And with the child, she goes to Dushyanta's palace. Again, no ring, none of that. When she gets there, Dushyanta deliberately lies. Because he thinks, as a king, if a random lady walks in with a baby and says that this is your baby, what will my people think of me? So he deliberately lies and says that, there are birds that go and lay their eggs in the nests of other birds instead of their own. And you're essentially trying to pass off something that is not mine as yours. I've never seen you. I don't know whose child this is. And Shakuntala does not cry. She gets furious. Her eyes, redden because of anger and rage. But she actually stands there and looks him in the eye and says, even without you, my son will rule. You rule the earth, I fly the skies. There is a certain defiance in that. Shakuntala standing up and answering the king's charge. When the king lies openly, she's not crying and running away. No Apsara comes to save her. She stands her ground and calls him out and says, well, gentleman, you're a liar, a lying gentleman. And that is the original Shakuntala. So when you compare that original Shakuntala of the Mahabharata with Kalidas's Shakuntala, which is completely different, the difference tells you about evolving social mores. It tells you about how society is changing. Society is starting to expect new things of women. So you add these elements where Shakuntala becomes very coy, where she's crying, where she's helpless, all of these things. Now, there's one more level of filtering which happens before the story comes back to us in our English books, which is that when Kalidas's Abhijnana Shakuntalam was translated in the late 18th century by William Jones, who was a judge in Calcutta, but also a great scholar of Sanskrit who did a lot of translation work. He was extremely embarrassed. Even Kalidas's version had a lot of sensuality in it. He was very embarrassed about it. So, for instance, by Kalidas at one point talks about how Shakuntala was so sad that her face was gloomy, her shoulders were drooping, and her breasts were sagging. And he says, oh, no, for my Western audience, I can't talk about breasts. So he keeps the shoulders and the face, but he completely erases the line which talks about Shakuntala's breasts. And it is this already transformed Shakuntala getting further sanitized by Europeans and translated into English that comes back to us as the traditional Shakuntala. So always in the retelling of history, there's something else that happens. Stories sometimes get embellished, stories sometimes get completely transformed, Characters begin one way but end up in a completely different way. In the beginning, a character may represent something. By the end, that same character may represent something else. All of these stories are undergoing constant mutation. And that's in general what happens with history as well. No historian can objectively stand up and say, I have found the truth, because that concept of the truth is always evolving. As more evidence comes to light, as more material comes to light, your understanding of what the truth is constantly keeps changing. Or what historians are doing is, with our existing perspectives, with our existing resources and tools, we are able to narrate or tell, retell, reinterpret versions of history. In future, somebody else will reinterpret it, and that's simply how it goes on. That's simply how it is. History is always an evolving craft, as much as a sort of science of certainty. It's not something where you can certify and say my history is the accurate history. No, it's always open to revision, and it's always open to change. And for no other reason than the fact that historical figures even go through historical, different kinds of meanings at different times. We mentioned, Chhatrapati Shivaji earlier. The great irony is that before, Lokmanya Tilak started the famous Shivaji festivals in Pune, and then it spread out. Before political parties, in the late 19th century, Indian nationalists were hungry for heroes. They required local Indian heroes of brown skin to stand up to the British. So that is when a lot of these, historical figures were dusted off these shelves and brought out in a new way. So Jyotiba Phule brought out Shivaji, saying, look at him, he was a protector of the weak. Tilak brought out Shivaji and said he was a protector of Brahmins and cows. Two people in the same time giving two different interpretations to Shivaji. The greater irony is that when they discovered the Shivaji Samadhi, near his capital fort, was completely ruined. It was overgrown with weeds. It didn't even have a chhatri. It was completely neglected. They appealed to Shivaji's descendant, the Maharaja of Kolhapur, to give money to repair it. He said, I'm not interested, because for him, this was just some long lost ancestor at that time. And he didn't trust the Congress people very much at the time. So he said, I'm not giving this. It took some 30 years for enough money to be collected to construct a chhatri, which is one of those canopies over Shivaji's Samadhi, to clean up the place and give it an appearance of respectability. Even somebody who is so central to our identity and politics today, such as Chhatrapati Shivaji, till about 1920, his own Samadhi was lying under weeds and rubble, and because nobody at that time had bothered to go and do very much about it. And it's not a good or bad thing. It's simply how human societies evolve. Human societies will always draw on narratives of the past, and for very contemporary reasons, we may end up resurrecting some character, putting down another character. 20 years later, somebody else will put up another character and pull down the earlier dominant character. It often happens in societies, and that seems to be how it is. And it's the same with historical narratives. They also keep evolving and changing with time.
So your notes are quite extensive. The bibliographies are thick, right?
104 pages in that book, yes.
Yeah, okay. So that's what we've noted. But besides that, you have relied on, obviously bibliography and the recommended readings. You've relied on the works of a lot of other authors while creating your own books. In addition, you seem also to have had long conversations, especially in the context of the Ivory Throne. Right? Is there a especially significant one that you would remember or like to narrate or tell us?
It's funny that you ask, because just this morning I got news that the son-in-law of the last Maharani of Travancore passed away in Bangalore today at the age of 104. And it's quite a remarkable story, because this man, I told you, these husbands of the princesses did not have status in the palace. And usually what happened is that every time a princess had to get married, the uncle, who was then Raja, would send a number of boys to them. They would stand in a balcony, look at whichever boy they liked, and they would pick that one. And in those days, they had to match horoscopes also. But the thing with royalty is, once royalty has made a decision, you can't go against it. So then the Brahmin is invited, and the priest is told, look, she has chosen that boy. You don't come here and tell me the horoscopes don't match. They have to match. You do what you are supposed to do as a Brahmin and make them match. And then the husband would be given to the princess as the consort. In this gentleman who passed away today, it's the most colorful story that I heard from him. He was born in 1916, passed away today. And in 1937, late 37, early 38, he was standing, with a bunch of his relatives in Trivandrum on the street, watching a procession where the Princess of Travancore, aged 15, was on the way to the temple during a birthday celebration. So there were the elephants, the soldiers, the big sort of, drama and hoo-ha that is created around royalty. And she was sitting in a palanquin, in a little palki. And as the palki was going, she looked out and she saw this particular man standing in the crowd. And there and then she decided, oh, I'm going to marry him. I've chosen. This is the person I want to marry. So she goes back and tells her parents, look, no need to look for a bridegroom for me. I saw this man on the street. I want him. And her parents are scandalized. They're like, this man, who knows what caste he is, who knows which family, who knows where he's come from. You can't just pick somebody off the street. And she said, no, her mother was the Maharani. She said, you did that. You looked down from a balcony and chose your husband. The aunt, the junior Maharani, was sent 5 boys. She chose her husband from them. She said, I've decided this. So then they do an inquiry and they discover that this young man at the science college in Trivandrum is suddenly to be uplifted. He's invited by his uncle, who's a judge, and said, what are your plans for the future? He says, well, I'll finish my graduation, I'll get a job, etc. And the man says, no, none of that is going to happen because you have now been chosen as husband to the Maharani's daughter. And suddenly he's transformed. He's sent off for a crash course in soft skills and how to ride horses and how to sit and eat with a fork and a knife. He's sent off to Madras to get a lot of fresh clothing and suits, etc., and formal attire made. And most hilariously, he's sent off, and it's funny that we live in a country now where people are very anxious about giving children or teenagers sex education, because this gentleman at the age of 20, he was taken to the family priest who was called Kakka Tapoti, and it was the family priest who gave him an education in how to make love to a princess. And this man was alive in 2011 when I first met him. He related this experience that he had, where one fine morning he was a science student standing on the street of Trivandrum, and suddenly he had been told he was picked by the princess and transformed into her husband, and how that completely changed his life. I found that one of the most entertaining conversations I had with a man who was already by then in his 90s. And yeah, since you mentioned it today, and because I was thinking about him today, this is the story that comes to mind.
Like I said earlier, good old times. Now, let me kind of get on to 2 very important questions that I think would have crossed all our minds somewhere or the other. The first one is about who is an Indian and who is not an Indian, right? And the second one is obviously about the conflict between Hindu and Muslims, right? Now, in Rebel Sultans, you've taken a great pain to paint a picture of this fascinating region, which is far messier. I mean, it doesn't give itself to easy generalizations or narrative bending. Was there really an embedded nature of the Hindu-Muslim conflict that you see through your research? Or, what is your take on being an Indian and the Hindu versus Muslim conflict? You mentioned about Basava, you mentioned about Chokamela, and I hope I get this right. You also talk about a Telugu text called Raya Vaka Kamu, right?
Yeah, Raya Vaka.
Yeah. Okay. So excuse me for that. So, what was it really that you kind of found out?
So it's people often go to extremes, right? So sometimes people say, oh, India was just this syncretic paradise. Everybody was happy. There were no fixed identities. There was no Hindu-Muslim conflict, la la la. Other people go to the other extreme, which is everything was Hindu-Muslim. If it was a Hindu king fighting a Muslim, it had to be about religion. One was protecting their religion, the other was attacking with his religion. Everything is seen through the prism of religion. Now, the fact of the matter is that the truth, as in most cases, is somewhere in the middle. And in India, it's particularly complicated because if you go back to the first or the earliest currently known usage of the word Hindu by Indians themselves, it was used originally by foreigners for everybody who lived in India. But the first usage in terms of identity occurs in 1347 in an inscription by one of the first Vijayanagara emperors. There were 5 brothers. One of them uses it in his inscription, where he refers to himself as Hindu Raya Suratrana, which is basically a translation of Sultan among Hindu kings. So there's a very interesting thing happening here. By that time, South India has various sultanates coming. The Delhi Sultans have come in. The Bahmani Sultanate is emerging. The concept of sultans is becoming very real in southern India as well. So when the man calls himself Sultan among Hindu kings, he's appropriating the political identity of Sultan and saying, I am also a Sultan, but I am a Sultan among Hindu kings. So he's also appropriating the foreign word Hindu and saying, I am a Hindu. So you see 2 things happening there. And there's no contradiction there. He doesn't think using the word Sultan is somehow against his religion. No, he's happy to be a Hindu Sultan. That's his title. Now, the thing is, when you talk about Hindu in that context of a king, he's not talking in our context today of a communal identity. When do communal identities emerge? In the 19th century, because the British come in, they do something for the first time, which is called the census. They have these very elaborate censuses across India. And suddenly each caste and each group discovers their exact numerical strength. Now, if you were in Kerala, for example, you would not identify yourself as a Hindu. You know, my ancestors would say, oh, we are Nayars. Somebody else would say you're a Marar. Somebody else would say you're a Nambudiri Brahmin. The Christian would be looked at and not called a Christian. He'd be called a Mapla. The Jews would have a certain word for themselves. So each caste seemed to have its own identity, and in many ways the Christians and the Muslims were also treated as a caste in Kerala society. So, for example, a lot of Muslims accepted the local matrilineal system of succession, which has absolutely no sanction in the Sharia. It has technically, by Islamic law, it's not to be allowed. But in actual practice, they were matrilineal. The names that were used were common across castes. So there's, if you go to Kerala and ask people about the name Kochunni, it sounds like a very Hindu name today, but it was actually the name of a dacoit who was a Muslim in Kayangulam in the 19th century, because people had very localized names, very sort of common shared experiences. A cousin of mine recently married a Syrian Christian girl, and we discovered that they have practically the same rituals. They also have the garland. When the bride arrives, you give her an oil lamp, and she has to enter the house with the oil lamp. They have all those, outer elements of Hindu culture that we do. It's just that each has at the core a slightly different religious belief. So the difference is that on the ground, things could be highly syncretic. But when you move upwards in society, when you talk about kings, when you talk about kingly ideology, their religion could inform a lot of self-identity. Why the case? Because kings need to project self-image, and kings do that by drawing on religious and classical traditions. Again, the best example to give is Shivaji, for example. Shivaji's father's name was Shahaji, and his uncle's name was Sharifji. Why are these two men named this way? Because the grandparents, who were associates of that African general I mentioned earlier, Malik Ambar, the grandparents could not have children for a very long time. So they went to a holy man nearby, and the holy man blessed them. And the story goes that he even gave them, some kind of an object representing Hussein and Hassan, and of the Shias, and basically gave that to them. He said, "You will have 2 sons, not to worry." After this, Maluji Bhosle and his wife come back, and soon enough, Maluji Bhosle's wife becomes pregnant, has 2 sons, and they name the older son Shahji and Sharifji. Why? Because the name of the holy man who blessed them was Shah Sharif. He was a Muslim Sufi saint. So Shivaji's father and uncle are named after a Muslim, not a Hindu. And so that on the ground represents a syncretic sort of thing, because they were at that time a regular country aristocratic family. They were not yet royalty. When Shivaji moves from that position to the position of a king, kings have to identify themselves with something bigger. Kings are never merely provincial. Kings have to link themselves to something larger. Today we have something like the constitution. Back in the day, kings linked themselves to Puranic sources, because no matter which corner of the country you're in, Puranas have a sort of appeal across India. If you're sitting in Kerala, you speak Malayalam. If you're sitting in Uttar Pradesh, you may speak an ancestral version of Hindi, and you may not have very little in common. Your caste practices may be very different from the person in Uttar Pradesh. But if you say Krishna to a person there and you say Krishna to a person here, they both know what you're talking about, because there is a common strand in the epics. So Shivaji, when he becomes king, has to cultivate. Firstly, there's a genealogical thing. So he's projected as Vishnu's incarnation on earth. He's sort of genealogy is constructed, giving him links to Rajputs in Rajputana. And he now starts sort of projecting his kingship in highly Hinduized terms. He uses the term Hindavi Swaraj, for example. He says, for example, that I want to get rid of Persian as a diplomatic language and replace it with Sanskrit. And you have plenty of evidence that Shivaji's kingship was highly Sanskritized. And that gives you that difference, that on the ground, people, it didn't matter if you're living in a village, it didn't matter if the holy man was Hindu or a Muslim. Everybody went there. Muslims also went, Hindus also went. But when you became a king, if you were a Hindu king, you tended to define yourself through Hindu elements, through Sanskritic elements. If you were a Muslim king, you tended to define yourself through Islamic or Persian influences. Even so, there was a lot of overlap despite that. The difference is, when it comes to the 19th century and the British, as foreigners, the British are trying to make sense of India. What they need is categories. What they need is classification. So the British start creating, after the censuses, these boxes. And they say, Acha, okay, all these castes, they don't have a common book. They're not Muslims. They're not Christians. Therefore, they sit in this box called Hindu. And suddenly a Khatri, a Nayar, a Naidu, they're all told that you belong to one community called the Hindus. And they also accept it, because this immediate thing of majority minority starts. Earlier, that concept didn't exist. People thought of themselves as Nayars, as as Dalits or Brahmins or Nayars or whatever. They did not think of themselves as one community of Hindus. Now, however, that suddenly has political potency. And this gets projected backwards into history. Once we've created that filter, we start applying that filter to everything we see. And again, it's mischief created by one Englishman, a gentleman called James Mill, who writes one of the early colonial histories of India. He does this thing where he categorizes Indian history as the Hindu phase, the Muslim phase, and so on, and the British phase. And after that, we've never managed to break out of it. Even now, when we think of the past, we think along those lines. There was a pristine sort of Hindu phase, then the invaders came and they sort of had the Muslim phase, and finally the British came. But if you do your studies, you discover that as late as the 18th century, there were places, for example, in Karnataka itself, in Coorg, for example, there's evidence of Brahmins actually being slaughtered in a rather diabolical way, because they did not want that. Their religion was almost completely different from the religion that the Brahmins were propagating. You have the feuds between Vaishnavites and Shaivites was extremely more furious about 1,000 years ago than we can think today, because now we think they're all Hindus and therefore part of the same category. But back then, Shaivites did not see themselves as having the same beliefs as Vaishnavites. And, there was a lot of rivalry between them as well. Even with Muslim kings, I've spoken about Hindus so far. Even Muslim kings, let's take the example of Tipu Sultan, since you're all sitting in Karnataka. You'll find a lot of his writings talking about jihad, for example. There's this wonderful book by a scholar called Caleb Simmons called Devotional Sovereignty, where he actually looks at the correspondence Tipu Sultan had with the head of the Sringeri Mutt, the Jagat Guru, who was, of course, a Hindu. And you actually have evidence of Tipu Sultan telling the Jagat Guru, please do so many pujas for me. At one time, he's invaded Kerala, where he says, jihad, I'm going to destroy all the Hindu kings here. At the same time, he's sending Shivalingas to Sringeri, saying, please install these Shivalingas in these precise positions, in these precise shrines, and do puja to them. He writes to the king of Afghanistan, saying, let's have a jihad against the British. And what is the jihad? The jihad means the Afghan king has to come down and defeat the Mughals, because the Mughals are cast as infidels. So the jihad is the good people on one side, the infidels on the other. He includes on the good side the king of Afghanistan, the Rajputs, and the Brahmins. He basically tells the king of Afghanistan, you must come, defeat the infidels, that is the Mughals, win the loyalty of the Rajputs, and raise Hindu swords so the Brahmins rally to your cause. And then the jihad must come to the south and defeat the English. So Tipu Sultan's jihad in that context includes Brahmins and Rajputs. On the other hand, when he talks about infidels, he's included the Mughals, he's included the Marathas, because they were also his enemies, and he's included the Nizam of Hyderabad. Two of these characters are themselves Muslims. So again, when you talk about, if you merely look at the face value and say, oh, look, Tipu's talking about jihad, therefore he's a bigot, you actually find no, his conceptualization of jihad is slightly more complicated, where the jihad army has Hindus and Brahmins in it, where the infidel army has enough Muslims in it, and that's simply how it is. And this is the thing, right? When people talk about Tipu Sultan, for example, we fall into the trap of an either or. He was either a great king who sort of supported a lot of Hindus, or he was a horrible sort of man who destroyed a lot of temples. Actually, no, he was both. It is not an either or, it is an and question, because kings did both these things. When Tipu's conquering Kerala, when Tipu's conquering alien territory, he's going to use not only violence, and he was undoubtedly very brutal in Malabar, but also jihadist language and destroy temples. But in his settled territories, in territories under his peaceful control, he's actually giving grants to Sringeri Matha. He's actually renovating temples. There's a time when the Marathas come and plunder the Sringeri Matha, and the Jagat Guru writes to Tipu asking for protection, and the Marathas have already sacked it and taken away all the money. And Tipu Sultan basically presents himself, a Muslim king, as protector and upholder of Dharma, and says that the Marathas represent everything that is wrong in Kali Yuga, everything that is evil and bad, and everything negative that Kali Yuga sets off. So all of this is highly more complicated than, unfortunately, political readings of history will allow. As I said, it is not to say that religion did not exist in the past and people were not motivated by religion. I'm merely saying it was one of many factors. A king had political agendas. At different times, he would use either politics, either other forms of legitimization, either religion, to different degrees to attain his particular goal. A warrior, when he transforms himself from a peasant warrior into a king, a lot of Indian kings were peasants who then sort of upgraded themselves into kingly position, they would also use religion to gain legitimacy. Otherwise, you're just another peasant. Somebody can come and say, what right do you have to rule? So you use religion to bolster your position and cast yourself as a great protector of Brahmins and cows and things like that, because you are in need of legitimacy at that time. Whether you're a Hindu, whether you're a Muslim, they were both equally susceptible to this. Even an emperor, a Mughal emperor like Babur, at one time he needed help from the Persians for a certain battle, and he had no qualms giving up his Sunni faith and becoming a Shia. And the moment his goals were attained, he gave up Shiism and again became a Sunni. He came to India and he did not utter a single sort of jihadist term till he faced the most serious battle in his life, where, of course, the Rajputs were coming to attack him. His best generals had gone off to Afghanistan. His troops had been defeated in all the smaller battles, and morale was really low. That is where he pulls jihad out of the hat and says, this is a holy war against the infidels, and gets their morale up and ends up winning the particular battle. Again, after that, he calms down and there's no talk of jihad. So Jahangir, at one point, he goes somewhere, destroys a certain temple. At the same time, he's going to a Vedic scholar who's living in a cave and having hour-long discussions on philosophy and Hindu philosophy with this particular half-naked, Jagat Gosen, his name was, in that particular cave. So it's always not an either or, it's more an and. And the real question is, in what context did each king do what he did and why? The question is always to keep asking, why did this happen? Not ever to take it at face value and say, oh, this is why it happened. You have to try and uncover why exactly it happened the way it happened.
So, and basically there was also this Andhra text which kind of called the Mughals has been blessed by the Kashi Vishwanath, right? Yeah. So there was it was no clear division between what was a Hindu and what was not a Hindu, right? And
that goes to your other question also, right? On even now, you asked earlier, how do we define who is an Indian and who is not? Here, geography and historical accidents matter a lot. Because today, when we shut our eyes and think of India, the image that comes to our mind is of the current map of India. But this map is of an extremely recent creation. Nobody in our 2000 years ago sat there and drew these lines and said, this is India. India at one point had a completely different meaning than it has today. Why is it that the greatest temple complex in the world is not in India, but in Cambodia, in Angkor Wat? And because, even that was part of a certain civilizational zone. Scholars call it the Sanskrit cosmopolis. About 1,000 years ago, before Persian became the big international language, it was Sanskrit, and Sanskrit was something that extended from, let's say, Afghanistan all the way to Southeast Asia. And that entire zone was part of what Europeans would have called India. And there were not only intellectual exchanges, there were religious exchanges. One of the Pallava kings of Kanchipuram, the Pallavas didn't have an heir, so they decided that they had to find a descendant from a collateral branch. And they discovered that a previous Pallava prince had married a Vietnamese or a Cambodian princess, which again tells you that today's boundaries didn't matter then. It didn't matter that they were in Cambodia. It was part of the same cultural zone at that time. They actually the Brahmins got on a ship, went off to this place, discovered a 12-year-old descendant of that prince, and brought back this boy of completely Southeast Asian features and installed him as Nandivarman II in Kanchipuram as the new emperor. So, so does that mean all the future Kanchipuram emperors were foreigners? No, it's just that this boundary didn't exist at that time. It didn't matter at that time. Even in today's map, there was, when Burma was separated from the main Indian empire, as it were, there were a lot of bureaucrats in the British service who wanted to give up what is today our northeast to Burma, because they thought, it, in a racial sense, in a cultural sense, in an economic sense, it has greater ties with what would become Burma, and therefore give it up to them. It was a technical decision to retain that with India. In many ways, even now we have porous borders there. There's a lot of exchange that happens. People actually go to markets in the frontier areas of Burma and then come back by the evening. There's a lot of exchange that takes place. Look at the northern frontier. The king of Ladakh, the king of Tibet, who was the Dalai Lama, the king of Bhutan and the king of Sikkim, they formed part of one particular cultural zone, and they used to have a lot of royal intermarriages that took place. One of the reasons the Chinese claim Arunachal Pradesh is because one of the Dalai Lamas was born in what is now Arunachal Pradesh, which they call Little Tibet. That's the thing with these modern boundaries. When we try to define who is an Indian by our present idea or our present political conception of the country, it is not historical. It is a choice we are making now. It is a choice we are making now. And that is why 1947, the framers of the Constitution basically said territorial nationalism. If you're born here, you are an Indian. That is all there is to the question. Because if you start looking for cultural interpretations, there is no map. Everything is all over the place. There are people in Sri Lanka, there are people in Southeast Asia, there are people in Afghanistan. Some would even go, to parts of Persia, saying all of these are part of that Indic space. But, as I said, boundaries emerge, and with boundaries come metaphorical walls, and we start trying to get into this hair-splitting exercise of, are you an Indian and are you not an Indian? But that's a very recent preoccupation.
Thank you, Manu. I'll now open it up to the audience. We have nearly about 70 participants today with us. So if there's anybody who wishes to kind of go ask a question, go ahead, unmute yourself, switch on your camera, and ask.
Good afternoon, Mr. Pillai.
Hello.
I have just started your Courtesan, Mahatma and the Italian priest. It's a wonderful book. I have not read many stories except 5-6 stories. And it's a very informative and very interesting book that you have written.
Thank you.
And I look forward to read all your work.
Thank you.
And this will also generate some enthusiasm amongst people to read history books also. And I your turn of phrase also, like you said, it's customary in one story you have written. And the Maharaja constructed Agrayaman, some kind of ashram for intellectuals. And with their princely modesty, they named it after themselves only.
Yeah.
Very nice stuff that. And you will definitely popularize history. I want to ask you, who is your favorite historical character? One. And secondly, I want you to ask whether the Indian society is getting better. You have studied the Indian society over centuries. I want you, are we getting better or are we getting worse?
Well, the thing is, I wouldn't qualify it in terms of better or worse. I would just hope that we are getting a little more aware of our past. If you're aware of the past in the right context and in the right or in the most constructive way, then there's no question of better or worse, because our job is not to sit and judge the past. Our job is not to sit and judge previous people for what they did in their context in a very different time. If you start judging people for what they did, then there's no point. It becomes highly political. Our job is merely to understand, and if we understand, I think it also lends a greater maturity in attending to present day problems. For this, again, this question of who is a nationalist, who is not. If you understand the complexities of this country, the kind of challenges it took to even create the country in its current form, you wouldn't really get down to that battle because you know that going down that road is highly dangerous. Look at our own government reports, right? So there's the Linguistic Commission report soon after independence. There's this wonderful line in it in which they say that we were alarmed by how thin the ice was on which we were skating, which is that they did not want to create linguistic states after independence because they realized that language can be a very strong source of cultural unity and cultural unification, and they had a fear India would split into different countries, because why should a Kannadiga go and care about what's happening to a Kashmiri? Why should a Malayali care about what is happening in Manipur? Their concerns are much more local, much more sort of provincial in nature. People wanted to avoid those battles, which is why they said, look, unity in diversity. That slogan that was plastered all over my school, for example, in my childhood years, it felt tedious at times, but it came because there was a mature understanding that if you don't hold up that principle, you're on a very slippery slope, because if you try to force one identity, people are going to come back with 20 other identities. In India, it's very possible. Within Karnataka, people in Tulunag may have an identity, Coorg will have an identity. They will say, we are not part of the mainstream Kannadiga sort of culture, and there is Kannadiga imperialism. Somebody in Karnataka mainstream will say there's Hindi imperialism. So there's all kinds of contradictory trends that are there. So knowing history and simply saying, okay, this is what happened in the past, it is complex, it is complicated, gives us a sense of sobriety. It doesn't allow us to be carried away by all kinds of political sloganeering, all kinds of random political agendas. That will end up, and remember, for us, of course, India as a democracy is a given. But if you look at the larger story of India, 3,000 odd years, we're merely a 70-year experiment so far. It's the blink of an eye. You can never take it for granted that this country will continue for the next 500 years in the same shape, in the same format, with the same institutions. You simply can't, because it is a complex country. Unless you can find a way to take as many people together as possible, you're creating a recipe for disaster, which is why a lot of the politicization of history is tragic, because it's sort of it's intended to use history as a sort of whipping cord to sort of beat certain communities or certain people, sometimes certain castes, and it sort of loses the purpose. That's not the point of history. And I don't like to sermonize too much about these things, so I try and bring out stories that sort of subtly challenge these views. For example, when I did this essay once, and it was a time when there was a lot of discussion going on about beef and whether people should eat beef, etc., in this country. And I don't know if you've read this in the third book yet. There's a play that was written by a Maratha king in Tanjore. Now, again, when we speak of diversity and things like this is a Marathi-speaking king ruling in Tamil Nadu, whose court language is Telugu, and whose generals and officials are all Afghans and Rajputs and Bundelas and people from Upper India. So it's a completely diverse court to begin with. And this Marathi-speaking king writes this play in the Telugu language, which is called the Satidana Surabu, which is basically "Take My Wife." That's how it's translated into English. And it's a remarkable, hilarious story, because in it, it's a parody of the caste system. So again, when we think our ancestors were all dignified, yes, Shahu, yeah. So he basically talks about how there's this Brahmin who's on the way to a temple festival. In the distance, he sees a very strikingly beautiful lady, and he turns to his chela and he says, "Look, I want to go and flirt with that lady." And the chela says, "No, you're a great Pandit. Think of the subtle meaning of Vedic words. Think of esoteric ideas." He says, "No, I don't want insipid eternal bliss. I want the bliss that comes with spending an evening with this lady." And chela can't do anything. They end up going to the lady. Lady turns around and she's a Dalit woman. She belongs to a leather working caste. And first she says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm married, so I can't flirt with you." He says, No, don't worry about that. Think of yourself as you would give land to a Brahmin, give me your loins. That's essentially the dialogue. Then she says, "Oh, I'm a lower caste, so you can't really have any dealings with me." Again, the Brahmin says, No, we created all these rules to hoodwink people. You forget caste and you come with me. Finally, in her desperation, she turns around and says, "Look, I'm of low caste, so I drink liquor and we eat beef. You're a Brahmin, so you can't have dealings with me." And he says, "Well, I drink cow's milk and I worship the cow. You eat the whole cow. You must be purer than me." Now, this is written around 1705 by a Hindu king. If today a playwright were to use this dialogue in a play, he would probably get beaten up. But by bringing this story to the fore, written by Chhatrapati Shivaji's nephew in the Telugu language, and it is still extant, if you bring this to the fore, you're subtly also indicating that so much for us getting so worked up about beef consumption today, our ancestors were perfectly secure in their identity. They had no issues where a Brahmin in a dialogue basically talks to a Dalit woman and says, "Because you eat beef, you're purer than me." He's lampooning the caste system. He's lampooning a lot of these Brahminical traditions. And in 1705, a Maratha king still had the cultural confidence to be able to do that. Whereas our touchiness today does not reflect a desire to protect culture. It reflects an insecurity. It reflects a sort of weakness where we think that we are not secure enough, and therefore everything, culture like a rock, you have to put it into a golden cage and lock the cage and protect it. That's not what culture is. Culture has always been about something that evolves, always been about something that breathes, always something amorphous. It has no fixed shape. It is not a rock. It's constantly changing. And it was also funny that that time the chief minister of Maharashtra was Devendra Fadnavis. I always found it very amusing that this Brahmin chief minister and local politics, his Brahmin identity was made a great deal of. It was interesting that his surname is actually a Persian word. Fadnavis, Parasnavis, these were all Persian words for various Brahmins who took up various services in the Islamic courts of the Deccan. And based on that, they were given these Persian titles, which became surnames thereafter. So even in our surnames, there is so much like complexity and diversity, where a Maharashtrian high caste Kokanas, the Brahmin, can have a Persian word for a surname. All of this, all you need to do is bring it out into the light and let the people themselves decide what they want to make of the past. So as I said, I don't sermonize. I try to just tell the stories and hope that people will, make whatever they will of it.
So Medha Parnas, you were there. You can ask the question yourself. She has posted in the chat box, if you can see that.
Hi.
Gender.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just wondering, how would you characterize the evolution of gender representation in Indian historical literature, including genders that transcend the binary?
Well, wait, you're asking me about gender binaries, or you're asking me about
Representation of gender within Indian historical literature, including the ones that exist outside the binary?
Well, that you would have to really speak to somebody who's a scholar in old Sanskrit literature, which is not me. But as far as I know, there was a fair amount of, let's say, there was a space available to talk of gender beyond the male and the female. For example, and this often happened in the space of gods. For example, if you look at the deity in the Sabrimala temple, Ayyappan, what is the founding legend? The founding legend is basically about this god being born from two male gods. There's basically Shiva, and there's Vishnu in the form of Mohini, which is Vishnu taking a female form, and they produce this particular male deity. And there is, if you read Madhavi Menon's writing, she's written a book on desire and sexuality in India. And if you read that book, you'll get a little more on this. You take somebody like Madurai Meenakshi, in Madurai, the great temple to Meenakshi. And again, in Meenakshi's legends, originally there's this king who doesn't have an heir, and the king therefore does this huge yagna, and out of the yagna emerges this child. Except that the king is praying for a brave, masculine, like male child. But what emerges is a triple-breasted, androgynous figure. And the king says, "What is this? I asked God for a son, and God's given me this freak." And the voice in the background says, "Look, this child will accomplish great things. You don't worry." And this androgynous princess ends up becoming a warrior, a great conqueror, conquers all of India till she reaches Kailash. And there's the twist. When she lays her eyes on Shiva, the third breast disappears. She becomes a coy, sort of more conventional female, more conventional woman, ends up marrying Shiva, and then Shiva is also brought and installed in the temple. But even so, if you go to the Madurai temple today, you will actually see all kinds of fascinating sculptures that do sort of challenge our notions of gender binaries. For example, I remember taking a photograph of a pillar, which basically shows the Mahabharata character Arjuna transforming from Arjuna into Arjuni, and then of course he becomes Brihannala. And in that stage, what you have is the sculpture shows a man in the sense that the face is a man's face with Southeast Asian features somehow, has a beard, but has a woman's breast. And this is a carved sculpture in that particular temple. And there are several like this that are rather interesting. Now, it will take a lot of advanced study to really make out what all of them are trying to communicate. But to me, I thought that was an interesting, very visual representation of something outside of the gender binary, something that was neither male nor female, yet was an identifiable Puranic character who had been put into that interesting space, in a slightly fluid sort of space.
Yeah, Mr. Manu.
Please go ahead, sir. Please go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, Mr. Manu, you have done economics from Pune and international relations from King's College, London, and turned out to be a historian. I feel that you are the right person to narrate few aspects about the taxation and international relations during the ancient period.
Well, that, you can read. It's funny that the Arthashastra has all kinds of ways that it recommends not only for the king to levy taxes, but also for the king to find out how people are trying to evade taxes and ensure that very little evasion happens. But I don't know much about ancient India, but I do know that a lot of things that we now presume, for example, we presume that all kings took land revenue and they took taxes on lands. It's actually not true, because a large swathes of Kerala, there was no land tax, because kings had absolutely no interest in land. They got their money from trade. They got such large amounts in customs revenue that they really did not care about land. And therefore, land was allowed to be Brahmadeya, Devaswam, given to all kinds of other institutions as tax-free gifts, because it did not matter. What is interesting is how much of Indian kingship was actually built on the idea of kings giving away tax-free gifts. A king giving away tax-free gifts was considered the height of being a good king. And you find in Tamil Nadu, for example, the Kallar Rajas. Kallar is often translated quite literally as thieves. They come from a caste that was considered robbers and bandits. And this gentleman, this dynasty becomes a kingly dynasty. But what do? They also gave away land, because that is, once you become a king, giving away land is considered extremely important, and giving away tax-free lands. Which is why when the British came, they were alarmed by how much land Indian kings had given away in tax-free gifts to all kinds of temples and Brahmins and various people who served them, that they had to then do these inam commissions and regain all the taxes. The other thing that I know a little bit about taxes is the amusing element of how when the British tried to introduce income tax in India for the first time, I think it was in the 1860s, Queen Victoria was bombarded with petitions in Buckingham Palace from Indians saying, oh, you know, you in your 1858 proclamation after the Great Rebellion, you had said that you would not interfere with our culture and our way of life. Income tax is a huge interference in our way of life. So please, as Queen of England, get rid of income tax. I completely agree with Queen Victoria's petitioners there that income tax needs to perhaps go. Some of us work very hard in it. Everything goes in income tax.
You also talk about a very strange tax on mustache, if I remember, in the story of Nagnelli, right? So
that was the other thing, right? So a lot of taxes were also based on caste. So, for instance, till the early 19th century, and taxes were then all kinds of things. For example, again in Kerala, because I know I worked 6 years on that one topic, if somebody wanted to tile the roof of their house as opposed to thatching it, they had to pay a specific tax. If men wanted to grow a certain kind of mustache, with a big twirly one, you had to pay a specific tax for it because you couldn't look grander and more masculine and regal than the king, for example. So, you know, who got to wear a mustache and who did not was highly policed. So much so that mustaches could sometimes be facial hair could be used as a symbol of resistance. So there's a story that when no, it's not a story, it's been noted by scholars, how when Jahangir and his son, the future Shah Jahan, were not getting along, one of the ways Shah Jahan protested was by growing a beard, because Jahangir was clean shaven, and by growing a beard, Shah Jahan was showing that I'm defying you. A Travancore Raja also had a nephew who didn't like him. He also grew a big mustache as a sort of affront to his uncle. So there were taxes on mustaches, there were taxes on jewelry. Who got to wear gold jewelry, who got to wear silver jewelry, all of that was taxed. And of course, lower caste communities had a poll tax on them, which was called talakkaram, or head tax for men, and for women it was called molakkaram, or breast tax, which is slightly misunderstood now. People think that it is a tax on breasts or a tax to cover your breasts, which is not true. But yeah, taxes were levied on all kinds of things in the past, and I suppose there, you know, you have the colonial system to thank for getting rid of a lot of these other taxes and introducing slightly more sort of broad-based taxing categories such as income and house tax and land tax, etc., rather than tax on facial hair and what you're wearing and what kind of ornaments you have, etc., etc. It is interesting. I'd never thought about, you know, a history of India through taxes, but there is an interesting idea there somewhere.
So what is the next thing that you're working on?
One more point. I thought I'll ask him. There's a lot of mysticism behind the treasures of Travancore hidden in Padmanabha Temple. You belong to that area, I believe, and then you studied a lot and interacted, and you are quoting a lot of aspects related to Travancore and Trivandrum and Kerala in general. You are the best person to tell us what you feel about this mysticism. How can some kind of chantings can create a kind of digbandhan and lock the doors? And that's what we heard, and maybe you have a little more information. Can you?
No, so in recent times, a lot of stories have been going around saying there's a curse on that final vault. I mean, of the vaults, only one is not opened yet. And they say there's a curse, and if you open it, the water of the Arabian Sea will come from underground and burst out into Trivandrum and all kinds of stories. But I think when they were doing when Vinod Rai, who was doing the audit of the temple trust, you know, looked into the records, he found that it had been opened about 7 times or something. It had been opened, and there was no big fuss in those days. Now, however, because religious sentiment, public opinion have come in, there is a certain amount of sentiment attached to it, and people don't want it to be opened. But the treasure itself is not surprising because, again, as a trading society, Kerala had all kinds of exchanges with the rest of the world. And of course, much of it was done with gold. And you know that is why I know somebody who's involved in the actual valuation process, and they describe having seen Arabic coins in it that are about 1,000 years old. Remember seeing Napoleonic era coins that came, you know, from Europe in the early 19th century, so about 200 years ago. So there's a huge spectrum of material that is there, and multiple theories exist. Of course, royalists say that the royal family donated the whole thing, but the chances are that a lot of it is also war booty, because you know, whenever kings defeated other kings, one of the ways to destabilized or delegitimized your enemy was by taking control of the temple and taking control of their treasure. So we know that the founder of Travancore did sometimes, for example, pay the Dutch. If an enemy king had pledged his crown jewels with the Dutch for money so he could fight the war, Martandavarma of Travancore would pay the Dutch and sort of buy those crown jewels from them, because owning those crown jewels of an enemy gave him a certain status. It increased his own sort of influence in the region. Similarly, when Tipu Sultan invaded, we know that a lot of Malabar royal families fled to the south. They went and lived in Travancore for long periods of time, many, many years. And it's very likely that these North Kerala kings were not very comfortable living for free. Just as the Travancore king, he had his honor, and he said, I will never charge money from my guests for taking care of them when they're fleeing an invader. So it's very likely that the compromise would have been that a lot of them donated large amounts of treasure to the temple of the king, because, obviously, that's a sort of compromise position. You're not giving to the king, you're giving to the deity, and king can also allow it because, it does him well as well. And that's why that's one of the reasons I think this was likely as a potential source of treasure, was because of this presence of Arab material there, stuff from Arabia, because Arabs generally gravitated towards North Kerala, not South Kerala. And only the Zamorin of Calicut coming to the south would allow a lot of this to end up in a southern temple. So it is possible there was that. There's also talk of Tipu Sultan in one of the battles was beaten back. And a lot of Tipu's personal items, his ring, his sword, his palanquin, all of that fell into the hands of the Travancore army. It is possible that they also got a lot of war booty at that time, and they decided to go and put that also in the temple. And we know that Tipu Sultan, as per oral histories, had vowed that he would come to Trivandrum and tie his horse on the flagstaff of the Padmanabha Swami temple. It's very possible that he had some of his material sitting in the temple, and that was one of the triggers. So it's very likely that the jewels come from royal donations, from donations by others, from trade, and goods brought by exiled rajas and donated in the temple, from war booty, all kinds of sources. And the sentimentalization of it is very recent, because now, perhaps for good reason, people see any kind of intervention in temples as an attack on the autonomy of the temples, and therefore they're not comfortable with these treasures being shown in public or discussed, etc. And that's for the temple to decide at some point. But as a student of history, I find it a little tragic that experts are not allowed to, for example, analyze the treasure. If you analyze the gold, you can date the exact age. That itself may give you a lot of clues to a different kind of history. And I think to that extent, it's a little tragic that nobody has access to it. But again, if people's faith is entwined in it, then such is. Not everything happens as you'd like it, so you live with it. It's fine.
So may I now request our mentor, Principal Chief Commissioner, Shri D.P. Nagendra Kumar, to come online. Yeah.
Amitesh, before that, can I ask one question to him?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, sir.
Mr. Manu Pillai, it was very fascinating to listen to it. And thanks to Amitesh for roping you in. It reminds me of various civilizations which were separated, practically separated, but they were there in Indus, Egyptian or Babylonian. But if you see the behavior of these civilizations, they are quite similar. Everywhere it is the nature only, the God, and in this form. Similarly, jihad has been associated with Islam. It's a good concept, as you rightly said, but unfortunately, because of the terrorism and terrorists using it, it has taken a different meaning. Don't you think we also have got the same concept in our Mahabharata when Krishna preaches Arjun? Is nothing but he's preaching jihad, saying that you have to fight against the evil and evildoer.
In fact, it's funny, the British at one point, I forget where it was, but in one of the projects I'm working on, there's actually this quote by an Englishman saying this Bhagavad Gita, if it falls into the hands of the rebels of 1857, they can justify any kind of slaughter and violence on the basis of that, which is that the ends are what matter, not necessarily always the means. And that kind of ethical fluidity made the British deeply uncomfortable. Funnily enough, a lot of the prominence that the Bhagavad Gita gets today is also because of the British. Because the British in the late 18th century were looking for one book to identify Hinduism with. Luckily, the Bhagavad Gita showed up first, and then it got translated into multiple languages. Europeans went gaga over it, and since then it became the big book of in reality, there's the Devi Gita, there's the Shiva Gita, there's all kinds of other Gitas. The Bhagavad Gita is the original, the main one, but there are a number of other rival texts from rival sects as well. But you're right, the Bhagavad Gita is also very fluid. In fact, Savarkar uses it at one point to justify, some of his positions. Gandhiji used it to justify some completely different positions. So Bhagavad Gita is again a text that can be read by different people in multiple ways. It can be read in to justify different things, and in fact, in many ways, that is the genius of it. It is, texts are timeless not because they have some secret quality. Texts are timeless because they can be interpreted at different times, in different ways. They're open to multiple interpretations.
Use it for their own purpose.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
that is the genius of the text.
DPN, sir?
I think, am I audible, Amitesh? I think for some reasons, I think my
You are audible, sir.
audio is, I think, am I audible?
Yes, sir. You're audible.
Yeah. Wonderful perspective from Mr. Manu Pillai. In fact, being a student of history myself, I think listening to him is like listening to a poem in continuum. Looking into history, I think learning from the past is one of the biggest things which can guide us for the future. When he mentioned about the different aspects of the societal life in the historic times, I think no doubt the king and the queen and the political heads played a crucial role in portraying the happenings during that time. But the truth of the matter is that I think this value, the culture, the pattern of living, etc., I think in the subaltern society also played a very crucial role in learning about history. I think throwing light on those aspects is what I think some of the historians in the Middle Ages have done. And of course, we have read more about that in our student days, be it in Romila Thapar or A.L. Basham. But I think what Manu has been trying to give a perspective to the royalty in interpreting the history from a perspective of, I think, how the not so important aspects of the history in terms of not merely winning wars or losing battles, but I think the way it had played an important role in terms of the values, what we talk about, identity with regard to religion, the family, the societal belief, etc. I think it's truly refreshing, and I think I had absolutely, I think, mesmerized with the way you went ahead and talked to our officers, and I'm immensely benefited. I think, to tell honestly, that I haven't read any of your books, but I would pick up a copy, I think, right away tomorrow and start reading it. I think hats off to you, Manu, for keeping us glued to your talk, so rejuvenating and so refreshing in approach. Thank you very much, Bharat Amitesh, for bringing one of the eloquent speakers to talk to us today evening. I'm sure I think our IRS officers community would have been benefited a lot, and maybe I think some of the ideas what Manu has shared with us today would keep us thinking about exactly how do we look upon this. Probably I think the biggest takeaway from today's talk is that don't judge everything what happened in the past from today's spectrum or the vision. Look beyond that to appreciate and be proud of it. There are good and bad in everything, but I think to be proud of ourselves and our heritage and our history is one of the greatest things in nation building. Thank you very much, Manu.
Thank you, sir. Pleasure being here. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mandlika, sir, any closing remarks from you, sir?
Yes, Mr. Manu Pillai, it is a very, very engaging and interesting session, and you kept all of us spellbound and with great details and fluency. And I really admire, I'm sure you have done such great research into every minute aspect of the topics which you have selected and gone into, and without which it is so difficult to present these minute details and narrate. And I'm extremely happy, and we are very happy to have you for the evening. And I also thank the president of the IRS Association, the Karnataka Chapter, Mr. Amitesh Bharat Singh, and his team to select Mr. Manu Pillai for the evening, and we wish we have similar speakers in future, and wish you all the best.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else wishes to say something before we finally wind down? Because we have detained Mr. Pillai for about 2 hours now. Okay. So, thank you, Manu. You have been a wonderful storyteller. I mean, you proved it once again through this interaction.
Thank you.
We are drawn to your stories because your stories are essentially our stories grazing backwards. As Deepian sir said, I mean, we learn from the past something or the other as well, and the possibility of learning something for the future as well. Now, the best part which I like about the way you write stories is allows to ourselves to be placed into it as participants in historical traditions and events. And now giving us the option to claim which ones we would like to and which ones we would like to distance ourselves from. So in sum, I think this is the way I would like to kind of conclude the essential points that you have made. You will be receiving a small plaque as a token of our affection and gratitude for having participated with us. I will be taking your separately your correspondence address through which we can send it. We'll be in touch. May I now request Anna, one of our younger colleagues, to come on formally to thank Mr. Pillai.
And thank you for the questions. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Absolutely.
Right. Good evening to one and all. Today we had the third conversation as part of the program series Exchange, organized by the IRS Association Karnataka Chapter. Guest, a historian and an award-winning writer, Mr. Manu Pillai, someone who has made history quite enjoyable for a lot of us, taking it beyond dates and names. As Mr. Manu of history from a different perspective, based on the evidences that come to the fore, it is quite important considering the fact that we've been left with a very colonial or a Western notion or the idea of Victorian morality in our culture. Appreciation at your different perspectives. Thank you very much. On behalf of the IRS community, I extend our gratitude for engaging all of us in this delightful conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. We look forward to connecting with you once again sometime in the future. Wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would also like to thank our patrons, Principal Chief Commissioner Shri D.P. Nagendra Kumar Sir and Chief Commissioner Sir Shri N. Srinivas for engaging, encouraging us and taking active participation in the active and share their thoughts with us. Today we had around 70 participants from our organization as well as outside. I extend our gratitude to all the participants who attended this session. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you once again. Special thanks to Kaustubh for effort in inviting and coordinating with Mr. Manu. Once again, thank you to one and all. Good evening.
Thank you. Thank you.